Hey, Dr. Alan Christianson here with you. Let's talk about oxalates. I got a note here from a gal named Sarah, and Sarah said, "Hi, Dr. C. I've been told that I have high levels of oxalates on an organic acid test and that I should avoid them to lower inflammation. Is this a real thing?" So, short answer, Sarah, thank you so much for writing in. I'm glad you did. This is a super important topic, and I'm glad you inspired me to look really deep in this. You know, short answer is, it's a real thing, but for a small number of people that have advanced late-stage kidney disease, it can be a real thing. They do want to keep track of their oxalates. But they also want to keep track of their phosphorus, their potassium, their sodium, their magnesium. A whole lot of things that are completely harmless to everyone else can affect people differently when they have bad late-stage kidney disease and are going into kidney failure. So that's the short answer of that, and hang on for the full answer. Let me give you some more detail. So let's get some context. And what are oxalates? Well, oxalates are organic acids, and they're fragments of compounds that are used to make RNA. And RNA is essential for DNA replication. So basically, oxalates are biochemical building blocks used by every cell in every living thing on planet Earth. As far as we know, all life utilizes oxalates and involves them in replication and growth. So critical compounds. Because they are essential, we do make them inside of ourselves. And it can vary based upon species and even within humans, based upon situation in life and health and factors that we're not even clear on. But somewhere 40 to 80% of the oxalates that our body uses, we make them. And we make them from a whole host of essential and non-essential amino acids. Others do come in from the diet, and we have the ability to make use of the ones from the diet and utilize them in chemical reactions as well. So oxalates, they make complexes with calcium. And these things, when they interact with inflammatory cytokines, they can make calcifications. And calcifications all throughout the body are there when there's chronic inflammation. You know, think about like a oyster, and the oyster has a grain of dirt irritating it, and it makes a pearl around that. So it wasn't so much that the calcium caused the calcification, it was more so that the inflammation caused the pearl to use the calcium to make the inflammatory compound, to make that calcification. So in humans, this happens in kidney stones, this happens in thyroid calcifications, this is also shown up in both benign and cancerous breast tissue. And this is a really important distinction. So oxalate and calcium can be used in a complex to make these calcifications, but again, they're not the cause of that. So like in the case of the thyroid calcifications, for example. So in the case of thyroid disease, Dr. Hikaru Hashimoto, he realized that lymphocytes, normal immune cells, were built up in people that had autoimmune thyroiditis. So the lymphocytes were there and they were associated with the inflammation. But lymphocytes weren't the sole cause of the inflammation, because we all have lymphocytes, but not everyone develops thyroid disease. So even they're there and they're present as part of it, they're not the sole cause. The question in the case of Hashimoto's disease is what made the lymphocytes attack something they really didn't need to attack. And so too in the case of calcium and oxalates, the question is not how did these things get in, but the question is why was the body inflamed and why did these things crystallize? What was the grain of sand that caused the body to build that pearl? And that's the ultimate question, because oxalates are used and they are necessary. So then we think about, since some of them do come in from the diet, which foods have them and which foods have more than others? Well, there's a lot of foods that have them. Almost all foods have trace amounts, but some foods are higher than others. And there's a lot of really healthy foods on that list. We've got things like spinach, rhubarb, rice bran, buckwheat, almonds, miso, wheat berries, navy beans, beets, cocoa powder. All these things are some of the higher oxalate foods. But no foods are oxalate free. Now that's how much is there, but that's not the same as what actually gets into the body. Oxalates are pretty tricky to absorb. In the same way they can bind up with calcium and make calcifications, they also can bind up with calcium in the intestinal tract and not end up getting absorbed. And there's a lot of other ways they can also be inconsistently absorbed. So one study looked at not just which foods have oxalates, but which foods have oxalates that end up getting absorbed and raise the level of oxalates in the urine. That ended up being a pretty short list. That came down to spinach and beets, rhubarb. Not a common plant, but northern Minnesota, we had rhubarb and we made rhubarb desserts. It grows like a weed. It's got these brilliant red stalks and huge green leaves. The leaves are actually poisonous, but the stalks are really, really sour and tart and got to be sweetened to be edible, but they just like take over the garden. So enough about rhubarb. So tea, chocolate, strawberries, wheat bran, and nuts, specifically roasted peanuts. Those are all foods that have high amounts of absorbable oxalates that do lead to high urinary oxalates. So other foods that have them, they may be there, but they just ride through and we poop them out. So they're not really relevant. Now, how does the body get rid of oxalates? Well, like a lot of things, the kidneys help regulate the balance of oxalates in the bloodstream because we're making some and there's some that comes in from the diet. And so the kidneys sort out how much we need and we spill off the rest. Somewhere around 95% of oxalates are cleared through the kidneys. There's also a fair amount that can be broken down in the intestinal tract. And it turns out that's pretty variable based upon the gut flora. It seems that some good bacteria like Bifidobacter and Lactobacillus help a lot. And there's also some specialized bacteria. There's a group called Oxalobacter. And what we see that they do especially is they break down oxalates. And so for a while there were theories that if oxalates were a concern, maybe you could adjust the gut flora. And there have been some studies done in which people that have had high urinary oxalates have been given these oxalate degrading bacteria. But so far, it's not been shown that giving these bacteria change the amounts of oxalate in the urine or the plasma or anywhere else. So we're not really clear on that. So what's the relevance of oxalates? The dietary oxalates actually cause health problems. It's clear we need some, but are the risks of there being too much? And the answer is a completely unequivocal yes, they can. And the people they can cause problems for are in two categories that may have a lot of overlap. The first group is those that have hyperoxaluria, and that's a genetic condition in which people actually make too much oxalate. Their body overproduces it, and it's excreted through the kidneys, but if there's something wrong with the kidneys, they may not get rid of it quickly enough. And that can lead to oxalosis, which is a condition to where oxalate can build up in the bloodstream. And that's significant. That's a time to where then they really can cause inflammation. But in this case, it's more relevant about how much the body is making, and there's a genetic glitch that causes the body to make too much, than it is how much you're consuming. Now, if you are in a state of oxalosis and your body is just overloaded with it, for sure, every extra amount you take in will only make things worse. But it's not that consuming oxalates actually causes oxalosis unless you have that genetic defect. And it's pretty rare. This whole thing about primary issues with, like the more common, for example, is primary hyperoxaluria type 1. And that may affect between 1 to 3 people per million. So it's not many. And it's a really big deal. You know, many who have it are diagnosed in infancy. It's like that severe. It's pretty rare to not see it be diagnosed and obvious by the time someone hits their 30s. In fact, about 90% of it have developed things as bad as kidney failure by the time they do hit their 30s. So it's not really the kind of thing that if you're our age, most of you are about my age, we're in our 40s and 50s and 60s and up, we're not really wondering about that. If that was present, it would have reared its head before now. So the other question we ask about is kidney stones and how these things affect kidney stones. And this is fascinating, and I'll talk about that a lot too. It is true that those that have hyperoxaluria are more apt to make kidney stones because they've got a lot of oxalates in the urine. Now, I've seen a lot of popular health articles that talk about that real thing of hyperoxaluria, and they then imply that the oxalates are a risk for others, and that because they can form crystals and they can create inflammation, and because they can be associated with kidney failure, that somehow these things are risks for others that do not have these genetic diseases. So the question is, do oxalates cause kidney damage? And I want to share a couple of favorite blog post article titles that I found with you. A couple ones I liked a lot. So one was, How Green Smoothies Can Devastate Your Health. And the tie-in is that greens are rich in oxalates, all of them are, and spinach were the highest. And remember we talked about absorbable oxalates. So spinach does have absorbable oxalates, and it's a popular thing in green smoothies. You know, it's super nutritious, it tastes good, it's easy to mix in. So yeah, other good one was the dark side of green smoothies. That was pretty ominous. But my all-time favorite, the award winner, was the green smoothie health fad, : this road to hell is paved with toxic oxalate crystals. So they actually paved the road to hell with oxalate crystals. That's really intense. And what inspired this? You know, this is something that there was a lot of the sky is falling in the natural health blogosphere and in the health experts, but honestly there was a paper that came out that I think created a little more fear, and it wasn't thought out all that well. There was a case report written up, and it was a sad story. It was a 65-year-old woman. She had some really bad symptoms, and it turned out she was in late-stage kidney failure. She was evaluated and found that was what was going on. She had had a gastric bypass surgery quite some time back. She'd had a long history of diabetes, and she'd been on a medication called moxifloxacin, which is a type of fluoroquinolone antibiotic, for about 6 weeks. And after this stuff came together, she developed kidney failure. Now, it also turned out that she was taking some green smoothies. And the article really made it tie in as if the green smoothies were the culprit. The article actually argued that dietary oxalates were the large factor, and that in her case there was no nephrotoxic agents. So what that means is there was nothing else there that should have hurt her kidneys. But that really surprised me that the researchers said that there was no nephrotoxic agents. So moxifloxacin, which she had been taking, that's a known kidney toxic drug. In fact, there's been papers written about that, things like risk of acute kidney injury associated with the use of fluoroquinolones. And it doubles the risk for that with people. And it's even worse in those that have had malabsorption issues. So what happens is the antibiotic itself, that class of antibiotics, can damage the kidneys. This woman with a 20-year history of diabetes, it's quite probable to have some compromise of kidney function just from that. So the antibiotic can directly damage the kidney, but also after gastric bypass, people have malabsorption patterns, and that makes them especially vulnerable to have the flora changes cause more dramatic effects on making the gut unable to clear any extra oxalate. Remember, normally the kidneys clear the bulk of the oxalate, but if the kidneys are compromised, the gut can take over a higher amount of that. But not if you've had a gastric bypass or if you're on very powerful broad-spectrum antibiotics. So there was a whole lot of factors present that made her more likely to have acute kidney failure in that case. It was by no means just the oxalates. And I agree with the conclusion that likely the oxalates may have been a precipitating factor, and they may have been part of why it happened then, but it also could have happened in the absence of those. And there's really no information from this case report that would connect the risk of kidney failure to anyone else that did not already have late kidney disease and many other factors giving rise to that. You know, in fact, and with kidney failure, some people are found to have calcium oxalate crystals throughout the kidneys. And that's been studied thoroughly. And they've looked and done analysis on, of those who have calcium oxalates in the kidneys, how many have been ingesting high oxalate foods, and are they actually the culprit? And it turns out there's been many that did ingest high oxalate foods, but every one of them already had late-stage kidney disease, plus other factors stressing their kidneys, like ingestion of high amounts of ethanol alcohol, which is not safe, not safe to consume, not the type that we can even tolerate effectively. So it's really clear that with late-stage kidney failure, things work differently in the body. And a lot of things that are completely harmless and we can regulate otherwise, like to an extent, you know, like sodium, potassium, protein, magnesium, phosphorus, these are things that we should think about, and we should get enough and not crazy amounts, but we're honestly not going to have our kidneys just give out if we have a little bit too much phosphorus or a few 50 milligrams extra magnesium. But in late-stage kidney failure, things are completely different, and the body has lost the ability to regulate a whole lot of things that normally it regulates just fine. So we cannot say what happens in late-stage kidney failure is what causes late-stage kidney failure and would cause that for someone else. The other question that comes up is oxalates and kidney stones. Now this link sounds a lot more plausible because many people do put out too much oxalate in their urine, And some kidney stones are made from calcium oxalate complex. And so it seemed really straightforward that if you could lower the amount of oxalate in the urine, you could improve the overall formation of kidney stones. And it's been studied really thoroughly. One of the conclusions from the last large meta-analysis was that restricting dietary oxalate is just not an effective intervention towards reducing urinary oxalate excretion. So you don't change how much oxalate goes out in your urine by lowering your dietary intake of oxalate. And again, that's because our body makes a lot of it. We make the bulk of it. So what does control how much oxalate is in our urine? The biggest single factor is just how hydrated we are. Another big thing is if we're getting adequate amounts of calcium. And then if we're overdoing sodium, that can affect it the wrong way. But reducing dietary oxalate doesn't radically change urinary oxalate output. And they've also had no data showing that a low oxalate diet changes the risk of kidney stones. And if that's not enough, check this out. There actually have been studies showing that some high oxalate foods can lower the risk of calcium oxalate kidney stones, such as tea. So people who are genetically predisposed to excrete too much oxalate in their urine and get kidney stones from that, they can have fewer kidney stones if they consume more dietary oxalates in the source of tea. So no, there's no smoking gun, and oxalates do not cause kidney stones, even in those with calcium oxalate kidney stones. So I've seen other quotes talking about not just kidney stones, but other health issues. One quote that I saw from a health paper was saying that oxalate accumulation has been associated with chronic pain, nephrolithiasis, which is kidney stones, neurological symptoms, vulvar pain, and fibromyalgia pain. And I want to cover all those points really well. So we talked before about how it's in some of the foods that this cited, but many of those foods do not have it in a bioavailable form. So yes, they can accumulate and provoke inflammation, but that's only in that case of oxaluria, which is a complication of a rare disease, number 1 to 3 per million. So do oxalates cause neurological symptoms or fibromyalgia? No studies on that whatsoever, and no plausible mechanism for that either. But what about vulvodynia, unexplained vaginal pain? There was a case report back from '91, and this was about a woman who was suffering with vulvodynia for about 4 years. She had had severe pain, and it was found that she also had high levels of urinary oxalate. And I'm not sure what prompted the doctor to investigate that, but he noticed it, and he thought perhaps there was some link. And I think it was well-intentioned, just wanted to try something to help. So he gave her calcium citrate, which does reduce urinary oxalate, and she seemed to do much better. She was pain-free for some time afterwards and could resume a lot of typical activities. And so he thought, well, let's check this out further and see if this is a possible trigger. Vulvodynia is a horrible thing that doesn't have straightforward explanations, and this sounded like a harmless enough intervention. So since then, there have been a couple of studies looking at the relationship between dietary oxalates and vulvodynia. One study did show that about 10% of the participants on a low oxalate diet had less pain, but the researchers concluded this is probably not a factor. So why was it they said that it wasn't relevant if it helped a small number of people? Well, the problems, there were a couple, one of which is that the amount of urinary oxalate in the women that had the symptoms was no different than it was in a similar group of women that had no vulvodynia. Also, there was no change in urinary oxalate in those that went on the low oxalate diet. The final reason why no one took that one too seriously was that they didn't have a placebo group. And they've done several studies and treatments for vulvodynia with placebo groups, and placebos work quite well, as they do in almost all conditions. So some studies have shown that topical treatments can work 20% of the time, more effective than the diet. And that was placebo topical treatments. So a topical study that was a cream for vulvodynia that had a placebo side of it, 20% of the women on the placebo cream got better from it. And another study looking at low-level laser therapy saw that this worked about 44% of the time. So if we saw that with vulvodynia, that women who had more symptoms had higher levels of urinary oxalates than women who were free of symptoms, and a low oxalate diet reduced their symptoms more effectively than a placebo did, that would be straightforward. That would have shown up. And that would be a great treatment. That'd be a great way to lower pain. But it did not work out that way. So there's no reason to think that it would be effective. Now, another thing I've seen mentioned is that genetic tendencies towards issues with oxalates. So there has been one gene identified that everyone has, but there's certain variants of it. And people that do form kidney stones have some variants of the gene that are more common. But so far, no scientists have said whether or not people that do not have kidney stones have that variant more commonly or less commonly. So we don't know if it's different in that group. We just know it's a pattern. And there's no data whatsoever saying that changing dietary oxalate changes health outcomes in those who have that gene. So who should think about this? Those who have genetic hyperoxaluria should be aware of it. And they also need to know that low oxalate diets are not the sole answer for them. And then those that have late-stage kidney disease can also be affected. But what if you've gone off of oxalates and you feel better from that? Well, a couple thoughts. So one of which is that there could be another way in which some of those foods are affecting you. We could think about histamine reactions. Some are high histamine foods. There can be intolerances. There's a million ways if you shift your diet a lot, it can affect you badly. Radically raising vegetables or fiber can be a really good step for you, but at first you may have a big change in your flora and you can totally feel off from it. So it's not always a bad thing, even if it causes those symptoms early along. The other thought is that when we hear about a food being harmful, that by itself can make it more apt to affect us and cause symptoms. We call this a nocebo response. And you probably heard of placebo. That's a pill that doesn't do anything, but if you think it might work, it can work. Even if you don't think it could work, it can still work, and that can be a placebo response. But the exact opposite is a really big thing. So you can take something that, even if you're not told it's harmful, you can have side effects from that. But if you're told there could be side effects from that, they're quite common. So one study, for example, a medication given for pain, 72% of the side effects that were reported came from those taking the placebo. They had headaches, nausea, the pain intensified. Many had bloating or fatigue or memory loss. They were taking a pill that was not active. It didn't actually cause those symptoms. And even then, nocebos are more than just causes of nuisance symptoms. The actual fear of harm can cause disease. You might have heard about like voodoo curses and whatnot. That may have happened, but a better documented scenario took place with the Framingham Heart Study. They looked at groups of participants who had cardiovascular risks, but also about their ideas about their perceived risk. And what they showed is that if all risk factors are equal, those who feel they're at greater risk for a fatal heart attack, that raised their risk for a fatal heart attack by 3.7 times, almost fourfold. So let's put that in perspective. High cholesterol, that can raise your risk of heart attack by 30-40% based upon a lot of variables. But smoking, not a good thing. That can double your risk of having a fatal heart attack. But being afraid of a fatal heart attack and thinking about heart disease, that raised the risk by 3.7-fold. This was way bigger than smoking or cholesterol or blood pressure or diabetes or anything else. So I cannot overemphasize how much symptoms can be caused just by the fear about food and just by having negative expectations. It's so real. I've been through that personally so many times on reading diets and getting convinced about this being now the one true way and getting symptoms from all the foods that didn't follow that path and having it last for a period of time and going on the next diet cycle, more times than I'd care to recount. But it's completely real and none of us are immune to it. And, we've got to eat, we've got to sustain ourselves. And to be fearful of the food we need is just the worst thing. And not only that, but these are really good foods. These are foods that serve us in so many ways. All the micronutrients and the fibers, they're good plant foods that are healthy for us to include. Okay, so let's keep going deeper. What if you've had high levels of oxalates on an organic acid test like Sarah did? Well, so organic acid tests, these are used in ways in which they measure the level of a lot of organic acids, which are known to be relevant to severe genetic disorders like hyperoxaluria. And the assumption made is that if you're severely off and this thing is through the roof, then if you're off by a little bit, then there's a small problem. And this logic does not follow through. It's like the fear about oxalates in the absence of a genetic disease. So this is really, these diseases are present or they're not present. We don't all have them to mild degrees. And the argument is that oxalates may be signs of there being dysbiosis or metal toxicity. And there's plausible enough arguments for that, but there's honestly more meaningful ways to measure these same problems. So to date, the tests that are done and the ranges that are looked at are not the ranges that are relevant for seeing hyperoxaluria. That's far outside of these ranges. So the subtle differences we see in organic acid tests are not meaningful or predictive of big health changes. I would not stress about that. What if you're concerned about kidney stones or kidney disease? Well, if you are prone to kidney stones, it's good to know what type. If they are calcium oxalate stones, then it's good to manage. And it turns out that hydration is the biggest single step. Adequate calcium is probably number 2. Dialing in sodium, not too much, getting adequate protein, those are important steps. But dietary oxalate change does not affect that. In kidney health, if you're not someone that has primary hyperoxaluria, then we think more about the blood sugar, the blood pressure, chronic infections, other things as being drivers of kidney disease. And they're good to be aware of and good to manage, but changing your oxalates will not affect that. So, what if you just want to be sure and be safe and skip the oxalates because there's questions about them? Well, there really aren't questions about them apart from some circles that have taken real risks in narrow circumstances and over-applied them. And I think they're well-intentioned, but they're misinformed. The foods that are high absorbed oxalates are foods that are good for us. Spinach, beets, tea, chocolate, strawberries. These are things that have a myriad of health benefits. And you're not served by excluding those foods from your diet, quite the opposite. And in fact, I'd even say you're harmed by being stressed about foods like that and other ones. So what if you are concerned, though, about just chronic inflammation or other digestive symptoms? In those cases, take a really good look at what could be causing that. Make sense out of your thyroid health, make sense that your adrenals are stable and have a good rhythm, learn about your gut flora, make sure your body has adequate nutrients and no big buildup of toxins. But the symptoms are important. We want to make sure that we're addressing those in ways that are meaningful and making you healthier, not just making you scared and cutting out foods that are good for you. Take great care of yourselves, and we'll talk again really soon. Bye-bye.